In the late 1950s, America had an obsession, and it wasn't subtle. Bigger was better. Flashier meant success. From home appliances to hairstyles, everything was inflating in size and screaming for attention. And in Detroit, carmakers were in a full-blown arms race of chrome, fins, and absurd proportions. Lincoln saw Cadillac leading the luxury pack and decided it wasn't just going to compete, it was going to dominate. The result? The 1958 Lincoln Continental, a car that looked less like a refined luxury cruiser and more like a confused spaceship trying to blend in with Earth traffic. At nearly 19 feet long, with a wheelbase of 131 inches and a body that practically bullied everything else off the road, the 58 Continental wasn't just big, it was massive. But the size alone wasn't the problem. It was what they did with all that sheet metal. Designers pushed the limits of taste and logic, giving it strange angles, odd proportions, and features that looked like they were dreamed up in a fever dream. This wasn't a refined evolution of Lincoln's past. It was a clean slate, but not in a good way. And the craziest part? Lincoln thought they were building the next American icon. But the public? They weren't so sure. The moment you laid eyes on the 1958 Lincoln Continental, one thing was clear: this design didn't know when to stop. Every inch of the car felt like it was fighting for attention, as if the designers threw in every idea they had and forgot to delete the bad ones. Take the headlights, for example. Canted inward at an awkward angle, they looked like the car was squinting in disgust at its own reflection. The front fenders had a bizarre concave cutout, like someone had taken a scoop out of the metal just to be different. And the body sides? Flat, slab-sided, completely vertical, as if the car had been designed with a ruler and no curves allowed. Then came the chrome. Endless, gleaming chrome. It wrapped around the front, spilled down the sides, and practically oozed from every corner. It wasn't elegant, it was aggressive. The whole car looked like it was designed to shout in a room where everyone else was whispering. Even by the flamboyant standards of the late 50s, this thing was overdone. One auto critic at the time famously remarked that the Continental looked like it was trying too hard to be noticed and failing, and they weren't wrong. Rumors floated around that even people within Lincoln's own design studio weren't happy with the final product. But corporate pressure and a desperate desire to outstyle Cadillac pushed the design over the edge. And the public? They didn't hold back. Some thought it looked like a refrigerator on wheels. Others compared it to a chrome-plated coffin. Harsh? Maybe. But when even 1950s America, a decade known for excess, calls your car ugly, something's gone terribly wrong. But as bad as it looked, the Continental had one surprising rival that made things even more complicated. In 1958, Cadillac wasn't exactly winning any design awards either. Its own cars had sprouted exaggerated fins, overloaded chrome, and massive grills that looked like they could swallow a mailbox. But next to the Lincoln Continental, Cadillac looked almost tasteful. There's a video floating around from that era that compares the two side by side, and it's hilarious. The announcer, barely hiding his disdain, tears into the Cadillac styling with dry sarcasm. But when he gets to the Lincoln, the tone shifts. Not to praise it, but to express shock. It's as if he couldn't believe what he was looking at. The Lincoln made the Cadillac look like a well-mannered cousin. Yes, Cadillac was flashy, but Lincoln was straight-up deranged. Where Cadillac had curves, Lincoln had slabs. Where Cadillac had fins, Lincoln had fins and scoops and bulges. Like it was trying to win a contest no one asked to judge. And that was the problem. Lincoln wasn't just trying to compete with Cadillac, it was trying to bury it in chrome and steel. But in doing so, it forgot what luxury was supposed to mean. Elegance turned into excess. Class turned into chaos. And style turned into something people laughed at more than they admired. Ironically, Cadillac's 1958 models, often criticized in their own right, benefited from the comparison. When your car looks better because Lincoln's looks worse, that's not a win. That's just survival. But what made the 1958 Continental even more tragic was that beneath all that madness, it was still flawed in ways you couldn't even see. If the styling was a mess, the engineering wasn't far behind. Underneath all that oversized sheet metal was a car that was just as excessive mechanically, and not in a good way. The 1958 Lincoln Continental rode on an all-new unibody platform, which, on paper, sounded futuristic. At the time, unibody construction was considered cutting-edge, stronger, stiffer, and potentially lighter than traditional body-on-frame. But Lincoln's execution was far from elegant. The unibody design didn't save weight. In fact, it made the car heavier, a lot heavier. Curb weight, over 5,300 pounds. That's more than many full-size trucks today. It was like dragging around a bank vault, and powering this steel giant was a 430 cubic inch V8 that produced 375 horsepower. Impressive on the surface, until you realized how much of that power was being used just to move the mass. Gas mileage? Don't ask. Officially, it was somewhere around 8 miles per gallon. Unofficially, owners joked that you could watch the fuel gauge drop just by idling. The suspension, while smooth, wasn't exactly built for agility. This was a car that floated, yes, but cornered like a cruise ship. It wasn't a driver's car. It was a couch on wheels. A very expensive, very unwieldy couch. And then there were the maintenance costs. Because of the car's complexity and sheer size, repairs were often complicated, expensive, and frustrating. Owning one was a status symbol, but it came with a headache few were prepared for. Lincoln had tried to build something revolutionary, but what they delivered was a car that looked absurd, drove like a tank, and drank fuel like a jet. And yet, instead of learning their lesson, Lincoln doubled down. You'd think after the backlash from 1958, Lincoln would take a step back, reassess, maybe tone things down. But no, Lincoln went full steam ahead. In 1959 and 1960, they didn't fix the design, they amplified it. The grille got bigger, the chrome got shinier, the lines got even more confusing. It was as if the designers looked at the criticism from 58 and thought, you know what this needs? More chaos. The rear ends grew more elaborate, the fins more pronounced, and somehow, the car managed to look even bulkier than before. These weren't minor adjustments, they were full-blown stylistic escalations. In a desperate attempt to reclaim luxury dominance, Lincoln leaned harder into the very things that had made the 58 model a punchline. It was like doubling down on a bad bet, hoping sheer confidence would change the outcome. And the results were predictable. Sales plummeted. Buyers walked away. Cadillac continued to outsell Lincoln by massive margins, while Lincoln's losses mounted year after year. Behind the scenes, executives were starting to panic. Rumors swirled that the entire Lincoln division was in trouble of being shut down if things didn't turn around. And soon, some reports suggest internal teams were demoralized, frustrated by upper management's refusal to change course. It felt like we were steering a ship toward an iceberg, one former employee later claimed, and no one was allowed to touch the wheel. Lincoln wasn't just losing customers. It was losing its identity. The brand that once stood for understated American elegance had become a caricature of excess, and something had to give. And then, in 1961, it did. After 3 years of bloated designs, falling sales, and near brand collapse, Lincoln finally pulled the emergency brake. The company had a choice: keep spiraling or start over. And in 1961, they chose to reset everything. Enter Elwood Engel, a quiet design genius with a vision that would change Lincoln forever. His approach couldn't have been more different from the chaos of 58 to 60. Instead of fins and chrome overload, he gave Lincoln a car that was sleek, simple, and sophisticated. The 1961 Lincoln Continental was born, and it didn't just look different. It felt like a statement. Gone were the outrageous curves and gimmicks. In their place, clean slab sides, razor-sharp lines, and perfect proportions. This wasn't a car shouting for attention. It was one that commanded it with quiet confidence. It looked presidential, because soon, it literally would be. That new Lincoln became the official car of the White House. President John F. Kennedy was famously photographed riding in one. Suddenly, the laughingstock of 1958 had become the symbol of American style and power. One of the most disastrous design eras in Lincoln's history had somehow led to one of its greatest triumphs. And the irony? Engel's design was almost thrown out. Chrysler, his former employer, had passed on it. But at Lincoln, it was exactly what the brand needed, a clean break from the mess it had become. The 1961 Continental didn't just save Lincoln, it redefined it. The 1958 Lincoln Continental is a lesson in what happens when a car company loses sight of what truly matters. It was big, bold, and brash, but not in a good way. It tried to outshine the competition with excess instead of elegance, and in doing so, it became a cautionary tale of design gone too far. But perhaps that's why it's so fascinating today, because buried beneath all that chrome and confusion is a turning point, not just for Lincoln, but for American automotive design. The failure of the 58 wasn't just embarrassing, it was necessary. It forced Lincoln to reevaluate, to rethink what luxury meant, and to come back stronger. And come back they did. By 1961, Lincoln had gone from building one of the most ridiculed cars of the decade to producing one of the most iconic. It's a story of failure, redemption, and the wild extremes of post-war car culture, where one wrong move could tank a brand, and one brilliant decision could save it. Today, the 1958 Continental is remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it taught. It wasn't just ugly, it was unforgettable.